Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm here today because I bumped into Tom in Brasilia, as one does, and I think he was after a drink, and he said if I buy him a drink, he'd invite me to an event in London, and I said yes. That's part of the reason. The other one reason is that I recently wrote a paper in Nature Climate Change that was titled Practitioners' Work and Evidence in the IPCC process and reports. I co-authored that with Candice here. So that's why I'm hopefully here to explain from a practitioner's point of view, or someone involved in a daily basis delivering solutions to clients around the world, looking at climate change, resilience and adaptation, about how that can interface with the academic community. And I'd just like to point out one thing about what Liz said. She said she had the best job in the world about organising cocktail parties. I go to those cocktail parties, so you can work out who's got the best job now. So I work for Mott MacDonald. Mott MacDonald is a global infrastructure and service company. We work in about 150 countries. We work in some countries that aren't very safe. We work in Afghanistan. We've got a big education project in Nigeria, mainstreaming, developing the education curriculum right across Nigeria. My role there is to build climate resilience into that. We're one of the largest employee-owned companies in the world. We have 18,000 staff, as I mentioned. We have a turnover just short of 1.5 billion. We're traditionally known for designing big bits of kit, big bits of infrastructure. So whether it's helping here in London on Crossrail, the large train set going north of London up into the Midlands and maybe one day into Sheffield. We do education work, we do health work, we do telecoms work, we do management consultancy, we're the largest provider of financial due diligence in the world. That is advising the financial sector on how they should spend their money, where they should spend it, what the risks are as well. My role at Mott's, I've been in place for 2 years, has been to grow the climate resilience work. I was tasked with developing a business case for what we should do in climate resilience. We identified that annually there's at least £100 billion, that's the minimum we identified, that is likely to be spent on climate resilience over the coming years. My role was to see how Mott's business I could grow that into an extra £100 million worth of turnover each year. So we've come from quite a small base. Mott's has invested heavily in the climate resilience work, and I work in a new division that's been established with group funding to grow that. We use the term climate resilience. My engineering colleagues get resilience. They don't get adaptation, they get the term resilience. These are the people who work with designing nuts and bolts to fit into one part of a bit of infrastructure that makes a huge bit of infrastructure. So they understand resilience. They want to build things that last. So on the climate side, they now want to build things that last in the face of a changing climate. Where have I got from? Why am I here? In terms of my background, I did my first degree at Sheffield University in the geography department 1 or 2 years ago. I'm very proud of that. I then went on to PhD in civil engineering and then went into something called the Climatic Research Unit. Where do we point this? Oh look, yeah, nice picture. That's how not to build resilience. That's Haysborough in North Norfolk. Completely failed in terms of resilience there, and there's not much plans to change it. So, map of the world. I worked at the Climatic Research Unit at the University of East Anglia for nigh on 17 years. Did a whole lot of work on projects and stuff. Did all the initial work on how to construct and apply climate change scenarios for practical examples. So that put me in touch with academics right around the world. So I was working very much in an academic community. I then moved on. I was also running a climate change master's course, or the original climate change master's course. So I had examples of how to write PhD studentship, fund the master's course as well. We had NERC studentships supporting that. And I was informing scientific policy. But I was getting, one of the things that turned me off a bit of academia was the conflict between different academics, even those in the same sector. You know, 1 step forward, 2 step back. It's good for the scientific process, but not always constructive when you're trying to solve problems. I then moved on to Natural England, which was just been formed as their lead on climate change. Mike Moorcroft is here, who is the responsible now for climate change. And one of the tasks there I was given was how to justify the £750 million of higher level agri-environment scheme spend every year. And we wanted to do that in a what was at the term adaptation manner, how you could deliver that HLS for climate change adaptation. I had to bring together the polarised groups of academics. There was a few small groups, very polarised, very different opinions, and really dragging the progress down, because one would say something and that would be critiqued, and the government was saying, well, you don't really know what you're doing with this money, do you? So I was there to convene those groups to make sure that we had a consistent and coherent voice about how to deliver that money. We looked then at the landscape scale approach to adaptation and bringing the science behind it. Natural England has been at the forefront of that approach. And it also gave me a feel about how you can really build a partnership between academics and the end users about how to use the scientific information. I left Natural England to go to the British Council to do something very different, still climate change, but working there to grow a global programme of what can only be described as the CSR, the Corporate Social Responsibility approach for UK PLC on climate change. So how an organisation that was there to deliver engagement and trust could to move into the climate change space. I was jointly responsible for a £100 million programme there. We were there to work right across society, from the arts to industry, all manner of groups, to try and build those partnerships and look at the difficulties about building those partnerships and how we could deliver a programme that was going to be effective. I built that programme on looking at a set of key barriers. I won't go into all these in detail. Cognitive, political, normative and economic barriers, and many of these are familiar with you. Lack of understanding of science, people not knowing exactly what's going on. And this feeds in from the academic side into the practitioner side. When consultants, industry are looking at the problem, they're getting the information not from the academic literature or the academics directly, but through third parties, the media. There's lots of bits around linguistic ambiguity, people using different terminology. I've mentioned resilience, other people use adaptation, and how this loses the momentum and also sometimes acts as a barrier between building partnerships. So all these different barriers are in place that prevent partnerships and action being taken in this area around climate change. So we use these barriers to underpin a very large-scale global programme, which was fairly successful. It engaged 100 million people and reached about 500 million people worldwide. I've highlighted some of these, but I won't go into them all. But they are relevant for most of the issues that hopefully we'll talk about here today. So I moved then into Mott MacDonald to work in a consultancy, and a big issue, one of the big barriers that exists there when we're engaging with the academic community, for me coming to an event like this, is for most consultants working in companies like Mott MacDonald, their time, our time, my time, has to be booked down to the nearest half hour. So this is not something I come along to willy-nilly. I have to justify my attendance here with my director. I have to build time down to a specific budget. So the typical consultants will be working 85% of their time will have to be billed to payable job codes. The rest of the 15% is around business development, etc. So that's a key issue that the academic community needs to understand when engaging with the practitioner community, that they can't do things for love most of the time. They have to justify it, and they have to bill that time, and they have to make a business case for every type of external activity they do. So within the wider context of climate change, I've been involved with the IPCC since 1993. I've been an author and I was expert reviewer. And in the latest round for the fifth assessment report, I reviewed the Working Group 2 chapters. Knowing that the Working Group 1 chapters, people understand the science. My engineering colleagues understand what 20% change in rainfall is. They understand what a 1 degree rise in temperature is. They look at the Working Group 2 stuff. They understand, oh, well, that may impact on this here, that there. But when it comes to the adaptation chapters of Working Group 2, they are, by most part, largely irrelevant for the practitioner community. So all that effort that's gone on in constructing those chapters doesn't wash with the practitioner community. It's written in a language that the practitioners don't understand. It doesn't provide any solutions for practitioners, doesn't provide any help for practitioners. So there's a big role here about how the practitioner community can engage better with the academic community to get the wealth of knowledge that exists in consultancies around the world, Mott MacDonald and the others, into the wider domain to help tackle the real world solutions. And that's where I believe and understand that the partnerships with the universities are direct partnerships whereby the academic can deal directly with the people providing the practical solutions, will help overcome what I know is the biggest challenge now that exists. It's not just tackling climate change, but it's understanding how to build climate resilience into all our work and all across society and the environment as well. Candice.
I'll give you a little bit of background about me. I started off, my first degree was looking at meteorology, so very much into the science, and I went on to do the masters that David was director for, and he was actually my master's supervisor. I've always been really interested in the scientific dimension of climate change, but from my master's and my PhD, I became increasingly interested into the social dimensions of climate change, but also in terms of the decision making, so at the individual level, organisation, policy level, the role of different stakeholders involved. And the type of work I've been doing since I finished my PhD involved working with, say, the National Union of Students, engaging students on sustainability, Imperial College, engaging with hard-to-reach audiences on environmental education in general. And in my current role, I'm a senior research fellow at the Global Sustainability Institute in Cambridge, and I lead the climate action theme there. And a lot of my research involves engaging communication with different stakeholders across different stakeholder groups to try and unpin and understand some of the barriers that David highlighted. Now, most recently, I've just finished a secondment at the Department of Energy and Climate Change. I was there for a year, and I was working in the International Climate Change Directorate. And I was leading on predominantly NGO engagement. I was part of the stakeholder engagement team, where we worked with NGOs, businesses, academia, a little bit with the comms team, with the press side of things, and a little bit with the science team. My role there was to facilitate the dialogue between the policy officials, the Secretary of State, different government departments, and the different key stakeholders that were involved in the policy process. This was in the context of international climate change, so EU policy, international policy, how this relates to domestic energy policy. And my experience in DEC really had quite a profound effect on me. I left my secondment, or throughout my secondment, I realised as academics, I think we're getting it completely wrong. Because when I was in DEC, any interesting academic article that I found, I would obviously try and push it in my directorate with the scientists, anyone who'd be interested. But no one would be interested, because I was sending them a 12-page academic paper that no one could be bothered to read, no one could understand, it was jargon, and they didn't understand how it was related to the work that they were doing. So I would often have to spend half a day rewriting an abstract completely, making it absolutely relevant to the policy objectives they were dealing with at the time, and then having a clear recommendation or question that a policy official could respond to very, very quickly. So my experience from that was, there's so much science out there, is it just useful for the academic community? Are we just publishing research that scientists are using and reading, and that their peers are reading? So when I left DEC, it shifted the way in which I've been doing my research, and I've been engaging a lot more with the different stakeholders I was working with at DEC. So I still work with the policy officials very closely, still trying to get through at that higher level, and now I understand why things take so long within policy, why it can take so long to engage with the Secretary of State on an issue, why it can take so long for academic research to feed in usefully to policy direction, to policy formulation. So as part of the research that I'm doing now, it's all in the context of co-production. So co-production, co-design of research from the very beginning, incorporating all these different stakeholders. So in the context of today's event, for example, the idea of coming up with research projects that are produced by practitioners in collaboration with academics mean that the research outputs will be that much more useful, that much more interesting. And I'd suggest at that early stage also to engage with the policy community in whatever shape or form, so that whatever research, whatever work is being produced can then also be fed into that community. It's very difficult to get through to a lot of policy officials because, same as us, they're incredibly busy, they're having to deal with hundreds of emails a day. So in communicating with them, as with all different types of stakeholders, it needs to be absolutely clear why the engagement with them is of use and value to them. As an academic, I'm curious about everything. So what I think is interesting to me is probably not interesting to most other people. So making it absolutely relevant to them is really key. And it's something that young PhD students and researchers are really interested in. They want that job after the PhD. They want to know that the paper they're writing is the paper a policymaker or practitioner is going to read. So to go into a little bit more detail about the research that David highlighted at the beginning of his presentation, we co-wrote this commentary in Nature Climate Change, and it was all about how can we make sure practitioner-based evidence, so evidence of what's going on the ground in the context of climate adaptation and resilience, can be fed into the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the process. The IPCC summary for policymakers are written by scientists and policymakers. There are no practitioners involved at this stage for a variety of different reasons. So what we're trying to do with this research, which has just started, is we're just doing a little bit of pilot project, a few workshops where we're going to bring together policy officials, practitioners and academics, all working in this space to help co-create, co-design what an IPCC structure might look like that could incorporate that practitioner-based evidence. Because the IPCC is all about bringing together, consolidating, summarising peer review evidence, and the type of peer review process that practitioner evidence goes through isn't the same as academic peer review. So we're trying to understand some of the key barriers as to why this evidence isn't already incorporated in the IPCC reports. But the IPCC Working Group 2 reports, which looks at impacts and adaptation to climate change, absolutely needs that evidence base of the engineers who are constructing the bridges that we're going to need to increase the resilience of. So what we're doing over the next few weeks is we're running these workshops. We're really trying to get people to challenge the way in which they do things, to find a way to collaborate with different types of audiences and different practitioners in the design of the solutions themselves. So it's very much at the beginning stages. A lot of the research that's been done in this space has mainly been looking at, for example, how can social scientists go in and investigate the IPCC process? There hasn't been much in terms of how can you bring in more knowledge, consolidate the vast amount of information that's out there in a way that's useful. And so this type of experience, this type of process is something that I found is really useful for the policy side of things as well, because when they go into the negotiation process on the politics or on the IPCC reports, they're able to say, the Secretary of State is able to say that he's based decisions on the most up-to-date evidence base. So enabling the research to take place and looking at evidence from across different communities is absolutely essential. So building partnerships with policy officials, with different stakeholders, with practitioners through PhD research is a really useful way to make sure that the impacts and the outputs are relevant and are useful beyond the academic community. So I'll just hand back over to you.
Right, so Candice, thank you very much. So hopefully that's given you a sort of perspective from the other side of, not the divide, but the other, the companies, the businesses that are trying to deliver the real world, not the real world solutions, the practical solutions. So whether it's my colleagues out in Nigeria looking at building resilience of the education sector to climate change, or whether it's those engineers looking at how to make sure Crossrail doesn't flood, doesn't overheat, etc. We need to get that best information, and we need to use that information to deliver the best solutions. But we also have a wealth of evidence within the organisations that can be fed back into the wider process. And I picked on the IPCC, but you can say the same for the climate change, the adaptation subcommittee of the climate change committee. All of the people on that are academics. You can look at the other activities that are taking place. Most of the people on the climate change risk assessment, many of those are academics. They're missing out on this trick about how you can capture a vast wealth of knowledge that exists in the practitioner community. As I mentioned at the start, providing the case studentship is one way of facilitating and allowing that exchange of knowledge between the business world, the practitioner world, and the academic world. And that can only be better and for society as a whole if we can facilitate that dialogue and we can make sure that the information and the data and research is delivered in the most effective way possible. Okay, thank you very much. And that's who we are.